Emily Sanders stepped out of her modest silver sedan and looked up at the weathered sign that read Willow Creek Retirement Residence. The early autumn air in rural Pennsylvania was crisp, the wind rustling the red and gold leaves that scattered the parking lot. With her nurse's badge pinned to her uniform and a fresh binder of notes tucked under her arm, Emily felt the quiet buzz of first-day nerves. She had graduated with honors, chosen this small-town facility to begin her career out of a genuine desire to care for people, and truthfully, to escape the noise and chaos of city hospitals. Inside, the smell of antiseptic clung faintly to the walls. The reception area was simple, painted in muted tones of beige and sage green, with generic floral art and soft instrumental music barely audible. A few residents sat in armchairs by the window, some gazing outside, others staring blankly at the television. The quiet was heavy, not peaceful, but dormant. "Emily Sanders?" a voice called out. She turned to see a woman in her late 50s, dressed in white scrubs and orthopedic shoes. Her name tag read Supervisor Helen Carter. "That's me," Emily replied, extending a hand. Helen shook it briefly. "Come on, I'll show you around." As they walked through the corridors, Helen spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. She pointed out the nurse's station, the medication room, the staff kitchen, and the 3 residential wings. The building was clean and orderly, but there was a palpable sense of routine, one that had calcified into something sterile. "Most of the residents here are stable. A few require extra care, but you'll be fine. Just follow the chart. Don't get too involved and you'll make it through your shift," Helen said, without slowing down. Emily nodded, though her heart sank a little. She had hoped for a more personal approach, a place where stories and histories mattered as much as medications and schedules. When they reached the dining hall, a handful of residents were already seated at their assigned tables. The room smelled faintly of carrots and broth. Plates were set, and the kitchen staff was placing bowls of soup and small portions of meatloaf in front of each person. Helen gestured toward a woman sitting alone near the window. "That's Margaret Ellison, 84. Used to be more communicative, but lately, not a word. Doesn't eat much. Don't waste time trying to talk to her." Emily looked over. Margaret sat straight back in her chair, her silver hair pulled into a bun, her expression unreadable. Her hands rested delicately on her lap, and she stared out the window as if she were waiting for someone. "I'd like to introduce myself, at least," Emily said. Helen sighed. "You can try. Just don't be surprised when she ignores you." As Helen walked off to oversee the rest of the dining service, Emily approached Margaret with a gentle smile. She placed a tray in front of her, soup, bread roll, and a cup of tea. She noticed that the soup wasn't steaming. She dipped her finger quickly near the surface. Cold. She frowned and looked toward the kitchen. Something must have gone wrong with the food warmers. Still, Margaret didn't seem to notice. "I'm Emily. I'm new here," she said softly, taking a seat across from her. "I brought your lunch. Sorry the soup is cold. I can warm it up if you'd like." Margaret didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the trees outside. Emily hesitated, but then sat quietly, letting the silence stretch. A few minutes passed. Then, to her astonishment, Margaret picked up the spoon. Slowly, she brought it to her lips and tasted the soup. Her eyes closed. It was subtle at first, a shift in her posture, a soft intake of breath. Then her mouth trembled slightly, as if forming a smile that hadn't been used in years. Emily watched, transfixed. Margaret swallowed and leaned back slightly in her chair, still with her eyes closed. "Thomas," she whispered. Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard right. The name had floated into the air like a ghost, light and nearly inaudible. Margaret opened her eyes. For a second, she looked at Emily, not through her, but at her. There was something lucid in her gaze, something flickering beneath the surface. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" Emily asked gently, but the moment passed. Margaret turned back to the window, the expression fading from her face like mist. Emily sat still, unsure what had just happened. All she could think about was the strange intimacy of that single spoonful of cold soup, and the name whispered like a memory coming back to life. Later, in the break room, Emily brought it up casually. "She spoke today," she said to one of the nurses. "Who?" the nurse asked, stirring powdered creamer into her coffee. Margaret Ellison. She said a name, Thomas, after tasting her soup. The nurse shrugged. She says all kinds of things sometimes. Old folks mumble. Most of it doesn't mean anything. But to Emily, it hadn't meant something. She felt it. She couldn't shake the image of Margaret closing her eyes like she had just traveled somewhere far away. Somewhere warm. Somewhere where cold soup tasted like a memory. That night, as Emily drove home along the winding road that cut through the woods, she thought of the expression on Margaret's face. She thought of how something as simple as a cold spoonful of broth had cracked through a wall of silence. She didn't know it yet, but that moment would change everything. Margaret Ellison had spoken, and Emily Sanders had been listening. The following morning, Emily arrived earlier than usual, the morning mist still curling along the edges of the parking lot. The scene from the day before played over and over in her mind. The gentle lift of the spoon, the closed eyes, the whispered name. She tried to tell herself not to overthink it, that it could have been a coincidence, a meaningless flicker in the fog of Margaret's aging mind. But deep down, she didn't believe that. Something had stirred, and she intended to find out what. During her rounds, she moved quickly through the residents' rooms, checking vitals, dispensing medications, noting behavioral changes. But her eyes kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes until lunch. When the time came, she made her way to the kitchen before the other staff could distribute the meals. She asked to prepare Margaret's tray herself and requested the same soup as the day before, but deliberately kept it cold. The kitchen staff gave her a few odd looks but didn't object. It wasn't against protocol. No one had ever requested cold soup before, but no one had ever cared that much either. She brought the tray to the dining hall and set it down in front of Margaret, who, as always, was sitting alone by the window. The older woman didn't acknowledge her, but Emily noticed that her eyes flicked toward the bowl as it touched the table. There was a pause, barely perceptible, before Margaret picked up the spoon. She tasted the soup again, slower this time, letting it linger on her tongue. And then she spoke. "Montrose Avenue," she said quietly, her voice like a breath of wind against glass. The smell of rain on pavement. He forgot his umbrella again. Emily didn't respond immediately. She just sat down, quietly pulling out a small notepad from her pocket. Without drawing attention, she began to write. Each day that followed, she repeated the ritual. Cold soup, same tray, same quiet table. And each day, Margaret gave her something. A word, a phrase, a sentence. At first, the words were fragmented, jumbled pieces of some distant life. Just playing in the back room, 2 sugars, no cream. Yellow dress with a broken zipper. But gradually, they began to connect, like puzzle pieces aligning not just through logic but through emotion. One afternoon, as the autumn light cast a golden haze across the dining hall, Margaret looked directly at Emily for the first time in days. "He used to hum while he cooked," she said. "Never could sing in tune, but he'd hum that one song, over and over. Moon Glow. I hated it at first. Then I started humming it when he wasn't around." Emily leaned forward. "Was this Thomas?" she asked softly. Margaret didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on Emily's, and in that silence, there was confirmation. The name had returned. Driven by growing curiosity and an unspoken sense of responsibility, Emily began to piece together the fragments in her notes each evening after work. She borrowed Old Town directories from the library, searched online archives, and tried to trace anything that might connect to the names and places Margaret mentioned. It was slow, tedious work. Montrose Avenue turned out to be a street in Chicago, and Moon Glow had been popular in the late 1940s and 50s. There was a cafe, a small one, located on that street during that time. The records were scarce, but an old newspaper article mentioned a young couple who had opened it shortly after the war, Thomas and Margaret Ellison. Emily's heart pounded when she saw the name in print. The cafe had closed in the early 1960s under mysterious circumstances. Thomas Ellison had reportedly gone missing in 1962. No foul play had been confirmed, but the disappearance had made local headlines. The articles mentioned that his wife had refused to speak to press, and after a while, the story faded. No follow-up, no conclusion. It explained Margaret's silence, why she had withdrawn from everyone, why her eyes looked beyond the room as if searching for something that had never returned. Emily didn't tell anyone about her discoveries. Not yet. She feared the story was too fragile, the memories too sacred to expose without care. Instead, she continued the routine. Cold soup, gentle questions, careful notes. And slowly, Margaret began to come alive in ways no one expected. One Thursday, Margaret recounted a full memory unprompted. "We made soup together that first night. He said it would be quick, easy. But I messed it up. I added too much garlic." He laughed. "I was so embarrassed I cried. But he ate it anyway, said it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Then we danced in the kitchen while the windows fogged up." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her eyes shone with a clarity that silenced clatter of dishes around them. Emily didn't write this one down. She just listened. The other staff began to notice the change. Margaret, once silent and withdrawn, had begun humming softly during meals, tapping her fingers against the table, asking for her tea to be served the old way. Some nurses joked that Emily had cast a spell. Others warned her not to get too attached. "She'll shut down again," Helen Carter told her. "It always happens. Don't let it break your heart." But Emily didn't see a woman on the verge of retreat. She saw someone thawing after decades of cold. The soup had become more than a meal. It was a bridge. Not to lucidity, exactly, but to connection. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Margaret turned to her and said, "You remind me of someone." Emily raised her brows. "Who?" "My niece. She had your softness. But your eyes, they're different. Yours are searching." That night, Emily sat in her apartment, surrounded by papers and photos she had printed from microfilm archives. She kept returning to the disappearance. No body had ever been found. No witnesses. Just a man who went out one day and never came back. Something didn't add up. She began searching old medical registries, focusing on Chicago and surrounding counties. If Thomas had been in an accident, if he'd lost his memory or been misidentified, her fingers paused over a document. A patient admitted to a psychiatric facility in 1962, matching Thomas's age and general description. No listed family, no known history. Admitted under the name John Doe 281. The photo was grainy, but something in the jawline, and the eyes sent a chill through her. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and dialed. "Hi, I'm calling about a patient record," she said. "From many years ago. I believe he might be someone else." The hospital administrator's voice was cautious on the phone, the kind Emily had grown used over her short but emotionally dense career. It was a voice of someone used to disappointment, of protecting fragile truths with the armor of bureaucracy. The facility in question was a long-term psychiatric institution just outside of Chicago, one that had changed names several times over the decades. The administrator confirmed that a patient admitted in 1962 under the name John Doe 281 had, in fact, remained institutionalized until his death a few years ago. His file was extensive, handwritten in the early years, and gradually transitioned into digital archives as the hospital modernized. But what caught Emily's breath was a confirmation that this man had regained partial memory near the end of his life and kept a journal. "I don't know what you're hoping to find," the administrator said, pausing briefly. "But if you're looking for closure on behalf of someone, well, you might want to read it for yourself." Emily took personal leave from the retirement home for a single day and drove to Illinois under a sky smeared with gray clouds. She had printed the address, checked the route twice, and packed a notepad where she had recorded every word Margaret had said over the past several weeks. Her nerves stayed taut the entire journey. She wasn't sure what she expected. Confirmation, perhaps, that this man had indeed been Thomas Ellison. But deep down, she hoped for something less tangible and more profound, a bridge between a woman's fractured heart and the life she had been forced to forget. The hospital campus was old but clean. The newer buildings gleamed with modern windows and concrete lines, but the older wings, where long-term patients had once resided, remained stoic and weather-worn. The administrator met her in the lobby, a tall woman with graying curls and a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. He never regained full memory, she said as she led Emily down the corridor. But near the end, he began to recall names, places, a woman he referred to as M. Sometimes Maggie. We believe he may have been trying to write to her, but he never knew her last name. His file said he was found after a pedestrian accident. No ID, no family. No fingerprints matched to anything in the system at the time. He was lucid for a while, then lost again. It happens. She handed Emily a manila envelope. Inside was a journal, worn, filled with yellowed pages, most of the writing in a cramped, uncertain hand. Emily sat in a quiet office and opened it slowly, unsure she was prepared for what lay inside. The first few entries were disjointed, fragmented thoughts about food, weather, strange dreams. Then, scattered through later pages, she began to see patterns. Saw her again in my dream. Blonde hair, laughed like rain hitting tin. She wore a yellow dress, smelled like cinnamon. Name, something with M. Soup, cold. She fed it to me in the memory. I was happy. Page after page, Thomas's entries became more vivid, almost urgent. The memory of Margaret, clearly Margaret, emerged in the fog of his fractured mind like a lighthouse flickering through a storm. Emily stayed for hours, reading and rereading. One passage, written shakily near the end, stood out. If I find her again in this life or the next, I will tell her I did not leave. I got lost. I never stopped looking, even when I didn't know what I'd lost. Tears burned behind Emily's eyes. It was Thomas. There was no doubt. Somehow, against time and illness and silence, love had endured. It had waited quietly. Inside the cold souped a fragment of song, the weight of unspoken memories. The administrator offered her a photocopy of the journal pages and a small plastic bag containing the few personal belongings Thomas had kept. A simple ring, a photograph too faded to identify, and a button with the logo of a long-defunct cafe. Emily thanked her, unsure of how to express the magnitude of what she had been given. The drive back was quieter, heavier. Every tree she passed, every turn in the road, seemed somehow steeped in a new kind of meaning. She kept imagining Margaret's face, how it might change when she heard the truth. Not just that Thomas had loved her, but that he had tried to return, that he had remembered. Back at Willow Creek, the air felt still, the sky had darkened into twilight, and a light mist hung above the grass. Emily entered the facility with careful steps, holding the envelope like a fragile relic. The dining room was empty. Dinner service had ended, and the hallways were quiet, save for the muffled sound of the television playing in the lounge. She found Margaret in her room, sitting in her usual armchair by the window. Her posture was relaxed, her hands resting on a wool blanket, and her eyes were closed, not asleep, but drifting somewhere between memory and presence. "I brought something for you," Emily said softly as she sat beside her. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her. There was no surprise in her expression, only calm curiosity, as if some part of her had been waiting. "It's about Thomas," Emily continued. "I found him, or what happened to him." There was no reaction at first, and Emily feared the moment might slip away like so many before. But then Margaret nodded, just once. "I always knew he didn't leave," she whispered. "I could feel it. Everyone said I was foolish, but I knew." Emily opened the journal and began to read aloud, choosing entries carefully, her voice steady even as her chest tightened with every word. Margaret listened in silence, her gaze distant, hands trembling slightly as the words sank in. When Emily reached the final entry, the one about finding her again in this life or the next, Margaret closed her eyes and exhaled a long, slow breath. For a moment, she seemed years younger, not because her face had changed, but because something heavy had been lifted from her. "He remembered me," she said, barely audible. Emily nodded. "He never stopped trying," she replied, "even when he didn't know who you were." A long pause stretched between them. Then, Margaret reached out and gently placed her hand over Emily's. It was the first time she had touched anyone voluntarily since arriving at the home. "You gave him back to me," she said. "You brought me home." They sat there in the soft silence, the journal open between them like a shared altar of memory. Outside the window, the mist began to clear, revealing the quiet outlines of trees swaying in the wind. For the first time in years, Margaret's heart no longer looked backward in silence. It had found its answer, not in logic or certainty, but in the unwavering echo of love long held and never forgotten. The days that followed were unlike anything Willow Creek had seen in years. Margaret, once considered one of the most distant residents, began to stir with a quiet purpose. Her steps remained slow, her voice never raised above a hush, but something within her had shifted. She no longer sat as a passive observer by the window. She asked to be helped into the garden, requested books she hadn't touched in decades, and, most surprisingly, began joining the dining hall at times other than mealtime, asking about the soup. Emily, still reeling from the emotional weight of the journal and its revelations, kept her composure but felt each day growing heavier with significance. She had shared everything Margaret could bear to hear. The story of Thomas's accident, the years of being lost inside his own mind, the fragments of their shared life that floated back to him like leaves drifting on water, and most poignantly, the way his memories had returned in flickers, led not by photos or places, but by tastes, sounds, and emotions too stubborn to vanish. It was that detail that had struck Margaret the deepest. The soup, she had whispered one morning, was not just food. It had been the last thing they created together, the last ordinary thing before everything unraveled. Emily began experimenting with recipes during her off hours. She pored over Margaret's notebook of spoken memories and tried to reconstruct what the couple's kitchen might have been like. One recipe in particular stood out, a cold carrot and ginger soup that Margaret had described in vivid detail. According to her, it had been a mistake turned tradition. The very dish she and Thomas had stumbled into one late summer night when the refrigerator failed, and they decided to serve the soup anyway, laughing at their own improvisation. The next week, customers had requested it again. Emily recreated it carefully, down to the soft texture and light citrus aroma Margaret had mentioned. When she presented the bowl during lunch one afternoon, Margaret didn't hesitate. One taste, and her entire face transformed. Not into a smile exactly, but into something softer, more open. She sat for several minutes after the first bite, eyes closed, as though letting herself be completely transported. When she opened them again, she asked for paper and a pen. "I want to write him back," she said, voice low but steady. Emily helped her draft a letter. It was simple, not poetic, but deeply human. Margaret wrote about the soup, about the years she had waited without knowing she was waiting, about the grief that had been her companion, and the quiet gratitude for truth she had finally been given. She ended with a line that Emily would remember for the rest of her life. "I don't mind that you forgot my name for a while. I never stopped whispering yours." The letter was placed between the pages of the journal and sealed in an envelope. Margaret didn't need it mailed. It wasn't meant to travel anywhere physical. She asked Emily to place it beneath her pillow at night, as if some part of her still believed Thomas might read it in his own way, wherever he was. News of Margaret's transformation began to circulate among the staff, not as gossip, but as quiet awe. Other nurses noticed that a few residents had started to engage more during meals, curious about what Margaret was eating. The idea that taste could awaken memory was no longer just a poetic concept. It was unfolding in real time. Residents who rarely spoke had begun to murmur comments about childhood dishes, favorite desserts, the smell of a grandmother's stew. It sparked something in Emily, an idea that would shape the future of the home more than any procedural change or medication ever could. She approached the facility director with a proposal. It was a simple program she called Spoons of Memory, designed to connect residents to moments from their past through taste. Each week, one resident would be invited to share a dish from their personal history, which the kitchen would then recreate and serve to the community. Recipes would be collected through conversation, recorded in writing or video, and preserved in a growing archive. The project wasn't about therapy, though its therapeutic effects were clear. It was about identity, dignity, and connection. To her surprise, the director approved it. The idea, while unconventional, was low cost and clearly rooted in observed behavioral improvement. Emily was given a small budget, some time to work with the kitchen staff, and permission to begin with Margaret as the first participant. Margaret embraced the idea, though her energy remained limited. She found joy in describing dishes, their ingredients, and the occasions they were tied to. One afternoon, seated in a lounge with a large notepad on her lap, she spoke about a particular lemon pie she had baked for Thomas's birthday every year. The crust had to be flaky, she insisted, and the filling tart enough to make you squint, or it wasn't worth the sugar. Emily watched her closely as she spoke. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was presence. Margaret was here again, not just remembering, but re-engaging with the world around her. And through her, others followed. Soon more residents joined in. Mr. Reynolds, who had spoken only a dozen words since arriving, mentioned his mother's black bean stew. Mrs. Carter wept softly while describing a simple rice pudding she used to eat with her sister on Sunday mornings. Each recipe came with a story, and each story unfolded another layer of the person behind the medical charts. In the background of all this, Emily continued to keep Margaret's story safe. She scanned Thomas's journal, preserved a letter, and even contacted a local museum interested in documenting forgotten histories of the mid-century Midwest. She didn't reveal names, only the outline of the story. A man lost to time, a woman found through flavor, a love that stretched across silence. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home and the halls had quieted, Emily returned to Margaret's room to find her awake, sitting in the dim glow of her bedside lamp. "I keep thinking," Margaret said, voice barely audible, "that if it weren't for the soup, none of this would have come back." Emily sat beside her. "It wasn't just the soup," she said. "It was you. You held on." Margaret turned to look at her, her eyes tired but clear. "No," she whispered. "It was both. I held on, but you stirred the memory back to life." They sat in silence for a long time. Two women from different generations tethered together by a story that neither could have written alone. The night pressed gently against the windows, but inside, warmth remained, not from heat, but from the quiet miracle of remembrance. The spoon, once cold and forgotten, had become a key, and what it had unlocked could never again be closed. The morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of Willow Creek's dining hall, illuminating long rows of tables, and painting soft shadows against gleaming utensils. It felt impossibly serene, as though the world outside had taken a moment to pause and reflect on the transformation that had quietly unfolded within those walls. Emily stood just inside the entrance, glancing at residents arriving for breakfast, some carrying their trays, others being guided by aides. But today, there was a palpable lightness in the air, an expectation that pulsed like a hidden heartbeat among the familiar routines. Margaret approached, steady but deliberate, her posture more assured than it had been in months. She carried a small tray, on which sat a bowl of the carrot and ginger cold soup, her creation, and a delicate teacup filled with chamomile, just as she had requested. As she took her seat beside Emily, their ritual felt somehow sacred. The cold soup, once an accident, had become the thread tying past and present together, binding memories, voices, grief, and renewed warmth in a single, unassuming bowl. Quiet fell as Margaret raised the spoon to her lips. Emily watched with breath held, remembering how a single spoonful had first begun the unraveling of decades of silence. Margaret closed her eyes, fingers wrapped around the ceramic edge, and when she opened them again, they were crystalline, brimming with something akin to recognition. "Heaven still sings in minor chords," she murmured, a fragment of memory, of a late-night tune hummed by Thomas as he cooked, a lullaby for two souls tied by love and bellies full of soup. She stilled, letting her gaze drift to the window, where the morning light trembled on the glass. Emily reached for the notepad she now carried with her at all times and scribbled the phrase. It felt as though Margaret had offered a secret, something meant only for their shared understanding. Breakfast passed in a calm, gentle blur. Afterwards, Emily swept through the dining area with a sense of purpose she had not felt before. The Spoons of Memory project was no longer a concept. It was alchemy, turning ordinary ingredients into bridges across time, across loss, across unspoken stories. She paused by a table where Mr. Reynolds sat quietly, his bowl of bean stew intact. She knelt beside him, tentatively asked, and gently coaxed his memory. He looked up, tears threatening to spill, as he told her about his mother, stirring bean soup on cold winter mornings, humming softly through the steam. Over the following days, the home seemed to breathe differently. Conversations blossomed, laughter floated to the hallways, and families visiting found the atmosphere changed. Their loved ones had returned in spirit. During one of the meal services, a visiting daughter observed, with shimmering eyes, how her mother lovingly described the scent and warmth of scones she used to bake, how she had once shared them with her husband on lazy Sunday mornings. No one had heard her speak like that in years. Emily, meanwhile, worked furiously behind the scenes. She compiled handwritten recipes, clipping notes from Margaret's stories, recording audio of residents recounting childhood dishes, attaching photographs when available. She met quietly with the facility director and proposed a community cookbook, an anthology not only of recipes but of memories. The director, moved and practical, agreed to a pilot print of a few dozen copies to be distributed to families and staff. One afternoon, Emily visited Margaret's room. The postcard-sized photograph of a simple yellow cafe counter sat against the windowsill, set beside the pages of Thomas's journal and the letter Margaret had tucked beneath her pillow. Margaret looked at her with a softness Emily could now identify, a peace, as though she had been offered a long-awaited reconciliation. "I feel fuller now," she said quietly. "Not because of food, although that helps. It's the rest, the knowing." Emily smiled, warmed by the honesty. "You helped us all remember who we are." Margaret placed a trembling hand on the photograph of the cafe. Its edges faded. "I'm going to visit Chicago," she said simply. The words hung in the air, fragile and brave in the same breath. Emily's heart lurched. It seemed almost impossible. Margaret, fragile yet resolute, embarking on a trip to a city she hadn't known in so many years. But as she looked into the old woman's steady eyes, she understood. This was the next step, a journey toward healing made possible by tiny everyday things turned extraordinary. That evening, Emily made the calls. She arranged transport, secured a caregiver to accompany them, contacted a small historical society in Chicago that maintained archives on mid-century cafes on Montrose Avenue. Together, they planned a quiet visit. The site of the old cafe, the neighborhood that had once housed the Ellisons' laughter, love, and longing. On the morning of departure, the sky was pale and crisp, autumn's embrace around the small Pennsylvania town. Margaret was dressed in a coat Margaret had chosen, the yellow one that Thomas had loved. In her pocket, she carried a folded letter written by Emily that morning. For Thomas, in memory and in spirit, it read, "Meant for the journey across time and space." Emily pressed a hand to her shoulder, and Margaret looked up, tears glimmering but not falling. As the van pulled away from Willow Creek, Emily watched Margaret through the rear window. Older now, certainly, but more alive than she had been in a lifetime. She thought of beginnings and endings and the strange dance between them. Margaret's journey wasn't just a trip across states. It was a voyage back to herself, to everything she once had and everything she could still hold dear. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Emily knew that the cold soup, the mistake-turned emblem, had offered a way forward one spoonful at a time. They were leaving behind more than just a retirement home. They were carrying into the open air the hope, the promise, the healing born of remembrance and love that had endured, even in the cold.